Good evening, everyone. We are Team Pakistan. I am Haris Ali.
My name is Aima Fatma.
I'm Dal Rafi.
My name is Amina Babar.
And my name is Ahmed Rafi.
My name is Fatma Qureshi, and firstly, we will be reviewing the first question, which talks about dynamic pricing and price elasticity of supply. So, dynamic pricing is a phenomena where prices fluctuate based on the economic activity. And a common example of this is in ride sharing apps. We see that during rush hours, the ride prices increase. This results in a movement along the demand curve. So, as price increases, the quantity demanded falls because fewer people are willing to pay that higher fare. But something interesting actually happens on the supply side. So the rise in price acts as an incentive for more drivers to enter the market. So since the drivers can now earn more, there's an increase in labor supply, which will cause the supply curve to shift rightward, and this is explained on the diagram as well. So we can look at this graph to calculate the price elasticity of supply, also known as PES. The formula in this case will be the quantity increase, which is from 100 to 200, divided by the price increase, which is from 10 to 15. And when you calculate this, you get a value of 2. This therefore means that supply is elastic. So drivers are going to be highly responsive to price changes. Dynamic pricing, therefore, doesn't just raise fares, it encourages more supply when it's needed the most, helping maintain a balance in the market.
Moving on to the second question. The second question deals with trust mechanisms and how they effectively reduce information asymmetry. Decentralized sources are used by such trust mechanisms to provide valuable information to the consumer about the contractor. This makes sure that the consumer makes an informed decision and helps increase consumer welfare. In addition, the second part of the question deals with possible limitations and setbacks of this current system. What ends up happening most of the time is that consumers will not use information about the contractor as a basis for the reviews. Rather, they will, due to many incentives, give reviews that don't accurately represent the contractor. For example, in many cases, contractors request good reviews, which ends up making reviews a favor rather than a representation of the contractor. There's also review inflation, which occurs when people consider 4 to 5 star reviews the norm and only give bad reviews when something exceptionally worse happens during the transaction. This results in the value and distinction caused by 4 to 5 star reviews to go down considerably, reducing consumer welfare and the effectiveness of these trust mechanisms. What do we give as a solution to this? We propose government mandated and approved software with requirements instilled. What will end up happening in our system is that the government will make sure the firms that are involved in the sharing economy and utilizing trust mechanisms follow softwares that will grade contractors on the basis of measurable indicators. So, for example, they will use things like ride cancellation on Uber to grade a contractor and give valuable information to the consumer, making sure information asymmetry is reduced and effectively making sure consumer welfare increases. The graph shows this very relationship. Information asymmetry is the best on our side, and it is the least effective when we have no trust mechanisms. What ends up happening with the user ratings and reviews is that they end up plateauing due to review inflation after reducing information asymmetry for a bit. This effectively shows how our alternative is the best possible solution and gives a clear answer to the question that was provided.
Moving on to question number 3, independent contractors or gig workers benefit from flexibility and autonomy. They can choose where, when, and how much they work, allowing them to align labor supply with peak demand windows, for example, surge in pricing. This dynamic can lead to higher marginal returns per hour worked, especially for those who are strategic about scheduling. In contrast, traditional employment models often involve fixed schedules and flat rate pay, which may not reward effort or time responsiveness as sufficiently. This is shown in the graph as private contractors have the highest amount of flexibility. However, classifying workers in the shared economy as independent contractors allows firms to significantly reduce labor costs by sidestepping traditional employee obligations. These include provisions for health insurance, paid leave, redundancy payouts, and contributions to retirement schemes. Furthermore, this model limits corporate accountability, as companies can sever working relationship without formal notice or justification, effectively shifting the risks of market fluctuations directly onto the worker. This arrangement weakens job security and exposes individuals to abrupt income shocks, illness, or injury without any institutional safety net. This is proven by the graph as well. Independent workers have the lowest amount of job security, only 20%. Furthermore, the contractor model fosters structural precarity. These workers are excluded from collective bargaining protections, have no guaranteed hours, and often operate without access to affordable insurance or retirement saving mechanisms. Additionally, in practice, many independent contractors rely on a single platform for income. This may seem contradictory, but in 2020, a report found that 60% of food delivery drivers who are inherently independent contractors worked only for one platform regularly and relied on that as their primary source of income, creating a sort of economic dependency while being denied the benefits of employee status. We need to achieve a middle ground where two extremes are avoided. We need to ensure that flexibility is maintained and job security is ensured for the labor class, for the labor force. A viable policy intervention would be the creation of an intermediate classification, dependent contractors. These are individuals who are, while not technically employees, derive a majority of their income from a single platform or firm. Such a category would entitle workers to basic labor protections, such as minimum termination notice period, for example, about 2 weeks, mandatory accident coverage, and access to retirement or sick leaves, without mandating full status, employee status, effectively maintaining the flexibility that an independent employee has. This approach preserves labor market flexibility while addressing the worst vulnerabilities of the gig model. It encourages platforms to maintain fairness without fundamentally compromising their business structures or operational efficiency. At the same time, it protects workers from sudden economic displacement and incentivizes platforms to better manage their workforce.
Right. So now moving on to the larger problem, which is the housing affordability crisis, that the problem that was given to us. One of our proposed solutions is that we want a progressive licensing fees based on property holdings. Essentially, what this means is that the greater amount of property that you register for short-term licensing, there will be a fee charged based on that, right? Essentially, what this aims to do is that we want to remove or disincentivize speculative property hoarding by individuals for short-term rentals, which is the big contributing factor to the reduction of supply and increased prices of housing for local people in the community, right? So what does this essentially look like? An example of this would be that we have these sort of brackets of area, i.e. 10,000 to 20,000 square feet of land being charged a 10% upcharge on a base rental fee, right? We also would like to recommend we'd also like to recommend that this licensing fees would be through this equation that we've given, which is in respect to the GDP increase, as well as the total square footage divided by 100 as a percentage, and this is changing based on these income brackets. Essentially, what this does is that it disincentivizes people to make sure that it disincentivizes people to keep their properties idle and make sure that they're always in use. And it also disincentivizes people from even registering short-term rental properties. And furthermore, the revenue that would be generated from these will help us reciprocate for the loss in the tourism industry by investing these fees and the revenue generated from it back into hotels, etc., which makes over tourism more manageable without essentially damaging the housing market.
Yeah, so moving on to the second solution, which is basically talks about zoning-based housing segregation for locals and tourists. Under this policy, the town council would designate certain geographic zones based on proximity to tourist attractions and key infrastructure. Coastal zones with scenic or beachside appeal could be allocated for tourist accommodations, including short-term vacation rentals, hotels, and resorts. Conversely, central residential areas, especially those closer to workplaces, schools, transport hubs, and hospitals, would be zoned exclusively for long-term housing, accessible only to local residents. These zones would be protected by legal requirements, ensuring that properties within them can only be rented or sold to people holding local ID cards or residency proof, ensuring that essential housing remains within reach for the nationals. This policy would effectively help reduce property demand in residential zones, stabilize rent prices, and ensure that housing supply is not fully absorbed by seasonal visitors. Another benefit that would be derived from this policy would be that tourism would still be supported by allowing short-term rentals, but only in designated tourist areas, which allows profit from the tourism industry to keep increasing and keep coming in.
The next policy that we focus on is incentivizing reuse and long-term leasing through subsidies. Now, this policy will focus on incentivizing property owners to shift away from short-term rentals and instead lease their properties to long-term rentals. This will be done by offering government-backed subsidies or tax reliefs to owners who commit to long-term leases of 12 months or more, with priority given to tenants who are local workers, young families, or those earning below a set income threshold. For instance, landlords could receive monthly rent supplements, reduced property taxes, or maintenance grants if they register their units in a long-term affordable housing pool. Additionally, the policy would also include incentives for adaptive reuse, supporting the conversion of unused commercial buildings and second homes or underutilized buildings into multi-unit housing designed for permanent residents. Now, these subsidies would help offset the higher profitability gap that short-term rentals often create, making long-term leasing a more viable and attractive financial alternative. Economically speaking, we talk about this policy using the concept of opportunity cost reversal, where we outweigh the benefits that these tenants face when putting long-term leases out in the market versus when we put on short-term leases out in the market. Over time, this would increase the effective housing stock available to locals and reduce dependence on market-driven vacation rentals. Now, moving on to the conclusion, Daud will give us the first few points.
Right. So when we look at the first two solutions, we realize that, okay, the first solution, what it does is that it disincentivizes or sort of reduces the supply of these short-term rental properties, right? And what that essentially means is that since there is now a greater supply of these properties, which are now open to long-term, we think that that in of itself reduces prices. Furthermore, we think that the recommended equation for creating a sort of percentage and these brackets, we think that that helps us make sure that people are disincentivized enough, just enough to make sure that they don't list enough or a lot of properties or lesser properties for short-term rental stays, right? But and also we think that redistributing this back into hotels also makes up to some extent for the amount that we might lose through this, right? But also we think that zoning is something that is completely equitable in a sense, meaning that people don't inherently want or require what residences which are close or near industrial areas of the city, etc. They would much rather want areas which are near the coastal regions, etc., which are for tourists. We think essentially where there's a greater demand for residents for long-term stays, we think that that should be reserved for long-term stays, and where there's a greater demand for tourist stays, we think that there should be that should be where tourists should stay. Essentially, what this means is that we sort of try to adapt to this market and try to make sure that this market does not entirely collapse or there isn't some sudden shock in this market, and try to sort of reason with it. Now, Ima for the third.
Lastly, we covered the point of having a sustainable long-term solution by introducing ideas like already making use of idle properties that are sitting and fill in the shortage of supply being faced through them instead of investing in new infrastructure. Moreover, we tackle long-term approach by not only directing and making policies for our housing schemes, but also directing the inflow of tourists towards hotels so that the GDP contribution that is being done from this tourism industry can also keep on running. Thank you. This was our presentation.